that's the thing that stopped me from getting into design for so long, was that I worked under the assumption that it had to be perfect. And that came from my board game design background, where I was like, it has to be perfect. It has to be balanced. We have to have the art done. We have to have everything ready before we can even like play test it. Which was like playtesting was so slow as a result, because we were like making full prototypes rather than just writing things down on paper. Like writing down things on paper and playing that is just as fun. So I learned the valuable lesson of just start putting it out there. It doesn't have to be pretty to make it worth people's time.
My name is Jeremy Gage, and welcome to the Draw Your Dice podcast. This is an educational show involving all things tabletop role-playing industry. Listen alongside me as we hear from creators, entrepreneurs, and supporters about their personal best practices, principles, and philosophies. I encourage anyone from the budding game designer to a seasoned publisher and everyone in between to sit down with us and enjoy today's episode. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today on Draw Your Dice. Today we have a wonderful and, in my personal terms, very successful guest. Not that any other guest will be any less or more successful, that's relative, but I think he has done an amazing job of blasting out content in the last 8 months or so. Absolutely phenomenal. Everyone, please welcome the creator of SlayersLight and the newly modular system Light, Spencer Campbell.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm going to pause for applause.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. That was really nice of you, by the way. That was all very nice.
It's all true. There's no niceties about it. I'm not being kind in the slightest. You deserve every bit of that. Spencer, why don't you talk about a little bit who you are as you present yourself to the world for the people, because you'll do a far better job than I will trying to tell people who you are.
Yeah, so I'm Spencer Campbell. I use he/him pronouns. Kind of like you said, I've just been blasting out content this year as a game designer. My day job, by day, I'm a psychology professor, and I've kind of dipped my toes between psychology and games in a few different ways. But by night, I've been designing games just a lot this year. I released my first game as part of Zine Quest, like at the beginning of this year, which honestly feels like forever ago at this point. And then after that, quarantine kicked in, and I was just thinking to myself, this is my chance. I suddenly have the time. I suddenly have the ability to really take a shot at this. And since then, I have been sort of self-publishing / doing some collaborative work on small one-page games all the way up to Slayers, which actually ended up as a proper book, which was surprising to me.
An amazing, amazing thing. And yeah, I think COVID, is a larger curse than it is a blessing for sure. But I think what it's really allowed, at least speaking to American culture, I don't know for any international listeners that may or may not listen to the show, but for us, I think it was a wake-up call of kind of breaking up, what we consider the 40-hour work week, and really letting us slow down and really letting us think about, man, what do I want to spend time creating, right? Like, I don't want to be sitting behind this desk all day long. I know we're in a modern age where not everyone's sitting behind a desk doing data entry, but I think it really allowed us to just sleep, like actually sleep for a second, wake up, feel refreshed, and go, I really want to make pottery. I'm really attracted to that. I want to try it. And I think that, especially for game design, this is the greatest time to sort of both tap into the art, but also mix up the industry. Because for a long time, at least in my opinion, I think it's very stagnant in the mainstream, that it's so traditionally based from the 70s and 80s and even probably early 90s. But now we have the advent of digital options. I mean, even with COVID, lots of people are trying to create digitally based RPGs that allow people to truly utilize virtual tabletops and things like Discord or Zoom or whatever have you. So yeah, I totally agree with you that it's been sort of a small silver lining in the whole spectrum of this.
Yeah, I saw a number of people who did exactly like you said. You know, my brother is a comedian in Chicago, and there, you know, shows are not happening in Chicago right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
So, you know, they try to do things with Zoom and things like that, but this has suddenly given him time to learn how to bake. He's never cooked before. And it's like he got super into baking. And my mom's a fantastic cook. And so they've bonded over this. So, you know,
Aw.
you find those small moments, those small things that you give you a chance to say, like, what matters to me? Or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
what can I bring into my life right now? Because so much has been taken away. I've got this huge void. What can
Yeah.
I fill at least a little bit of that void with? And similarly, then, like you were saying, in the design space, we lost our ability to play games at the tabletop. We
Mm-hmm.
lost our ability to do that. And so that is fundamentally changing the way we think about designing games, publishing games, putting them out
Mm-hmm.
there, and playing them. Like you said, in terms of utilizing cool tools like virtual tabletops, Discord, stuff like that. So yeah, there's that small silver lining, you know, with the looming curse of COVID
Yeah,
above
yeah,
us.
absolutely. So I know you mentioned a little bit that you teach psychology, but also I like to, before we get into the nitty-gritty of design, I like to remind people that game designers are more than the games they design. So kind of give us a small walkthrough of what led you to, like, you know, what was your first game? What led you to start wanting to design games? And I know that this year gave you the time, but what was sort of that first spark of that back of the mind saying, like, you know, I can make something like this, or I can make something off this?
So I didn't start doing role playing game design until about like 2 years ago, I would say. Before that, though, I had for years been working with my friend Mike Riemann, who was the illustrator and graphic designer for Dust. He and I, we lived in Chicago near each other. We would meet every Sunday, and we would design together. But we would design board games and card games. Huge, well before I got into role playing games, I was really, and I still am, into board games. And so we he had always wanted, he's a creative guy. He'd always wanted to make something of his own, but he didn't have he didn't have the thought process of how to like codify rule systems. Like he had big picture ideas, but how to like put them into a box was the
Mm-hmm.
harder thing for him. And me, I couldn't think big picture like that. I that artistic side of me hadn't blossomed in any way. But if you ask my parents, since I was like 5 years old, I've been making rules to games. So if my mom is telling the truth, like rule making has been a thing in my blood since I was a kid. And so Mike and I gathered and we bonded and became very good friends because of that. And so we had been trying and iterating on board games and card games for a long time. And that industry is just, it's a nightmare to try and get into. It's very, there's a lot more steps. There's a lot more you have to get through because so much of it is physical components, and balance actually kind of matters in a board game when for me, like in role-playing games, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah.
So we had fun. We made tons of prototypes, but we never made anything. And for me, I wanted to finally like put something out to the world. And I had been tinkering with a few ideas of role-playing games because I had just started playing when I was in grad school, and I was the forever GM. Nobody else wanted to GM, so I was the forever GM. I was already doing design because I think a GM is a designer. So in a way, I was doing something already. And that's when I learned about Zine Quest. And I was like, this is it. This is going to be the thing that finally, like, if I have a deadline, I work better. Mike and I never had deadlines. It was just we're gonna meet on Sunday and we're gonna have fun for 4 hours, drinking coffee and making games, but not actually publishing them. But now Zine Quest, I was like, there are rules and there's a deadline and an obligation. I can do this. I work well with this, and that's what got me to go. All right, let's. And I sat down with Mike because again, he's a graphic designer. He did the layout and graphic design for Score, which was my Zine Quest game, and kind of took off from there. So started in board games, although apparently started when I was 5. He asked my mom. And then, so it's all about structure, I think. I think that's the through line of this, is that my life is a life that likes structure. Like a 5-year-old Spencer was like, no, we need rules. And I want to make the rules, to Mike bringing me in to help him box up his ideas, to me needing the structure of Zine Quest to actually produce anything.
That's amazing. That is probably the epitome. I've known what I've wanted to be since I was young, sort of, kind of, is that classic story. And that's really cool that you come from sort of a more, what I want to say is mega heavily structured environment of board games. And that sort of helps you. I think that it is one of your advantages is kind of learning about how that marketing, that publishing and all of that works, and figuring out what all the cost effectiveness of the board game is, and then transitioning that into an RPG, which is a little bit less taxing on physical product, but certainly shares the same scope, of our traditional or modern / traditional, because it becomes traditional at some point, marketing and publishing schisms and everything like that. So that's really cool that you sort of built those skills along your career, especially in a structured state, which I think a lot of us, at least for me, when I first started approaching game design, it's very full art. Like, I'm the big picture guy, but I can't for the life of me figure out what dice you should be rolling or what feels right. And I'm like, but I just want them to feel like they're Ryu from Street Fighter. What happens next? So that's really cool. Cool. Well, let's get into talking about some design choices, philosophies, and principles. So for those who might have never heard of Spencer, or have been listening to this show / never listened to the show before, usually we will talk about like past design decisions that a creator has made for their game. However, Spencer is a special case. He has very recently, on sort of, I call it semi-mainstream, like mainstream area where like rides just under D&D stuff, but rides just above like obscure indie. Spencer has a bunch of content out there already talking about his past design decisions with his games, especially on his own YouTube channel, which will be in the show notes below, that you can kind of tack onto and listen to all those things. But I didn't want to sort of copy pasta that's copy paste for anyone that doesn't understand the lingo. Those sorts of comments, again, I feel like they're already out there. You can certainly go find them, and they are available for free for sure. What I want to get into today with Spencer, and what we've kind of talked about behind the scenes a little bit, is what he would do if he were to do the same thing again. And what I mean by that is maybe like a second edition of something, or what he may have learned from his Kickstarter or publishing journeys with sort of his bigger projects like Slayer, and to some, I can't remember, is Corvid Court, was it kickstarted?
No, that was a fever dream that came out in a 2-day writing period.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What, in 2 days? I didn't even know that. What? Oh. He has so many games. His website will also be, both his itch and his website will be in the show notes as well, if anyone wants to check out the breadth of games he's created in 365 days. So, Spencer, I guess, because we're going to talk about Light a little bit later, which is your newest project, and I know it's got a current amount of buzz to it, but, whoever listens to this podcast a year down the line, praise, I'm still doing this a year from now, and people like what I'm doing. But I want to sort of touch base on what would you do again, like what would you change about Slayer if you were going to, or even Corvid Court, sort of either one of those two games. I know there's some of your more popular ones, especially amongst the Brain Trust. And you also have the game Season, so feel free to touch on that as well. But what would you do in a second edition for, let's start with Slayers. I know watching your design commentary, you talked about both sort of the game loop structure you created with the adventures, like the 3-act structure stuff. And I know you also talked about some classes that couldn't quite make it in, but were going to come back in like maybe later editions or expansions or whatever you were planning. So yeah, kind of pick one and let's riff on that.
Yeah, this is, I'm excited to talk about this because this is something that has just been like burning. It's a fire in my mind for a while, of this idea of, do I just kind of keep updating games, or do I step away from them for a while? Do I brew and then eventually come up with like a bigger thing? Like, is it version 2.0 or is second edition, whatever you want to call it? Like, what is the process to follow with this? Because, so for Corvid Court, for example, when I first released it, like I said, it was one of those fever dream ideas that I had, that I wrote it in 2 days, and it was with a really amateur layout that had some stock art from a site that I have like a subscription to. And, it looked like somebody who had never done this before, but it had interesting words inside. And it was very fun to write. And then I got Maria to make it actually look good. And she did the layout and it actually looks fantastic. But, in my mind, I was thinking if there's going to be a new layout, is this my opportunity to add more rules to the game? And I did. There were updated rules. There were more skills and things like that were added into the game. I didn't call it Corvid Court Second Edition because none of it felt substantial enough. But I don't think I'm done with Corvid Court. So in my head, I'm wondering when do I go back to it, and what is the scale at which I want to approach that game?
Spencer, would you, for the people at home who may not have heard of Corvid Court, would you just give a very small introduction about what that game is?
Oh, yeah, sure. So Corvid Court is a game. It's a crow-themed game. Mean birds doing bad things is how I usually pitch it, is bad birds doing mean things or something like that. It's a game that uses the resistance system, which is made famous with Spire and Heart, but uses what I call resistance light because I sliced off a whole bunch of the things. I wanted it to be very quick. And so it takes place in a weird city. You're members of the Corvid Court. The classes have names that are different Corvids. So you've got a crow, a raven, a jay, and a magpie, and you do bad things. Like you're a crime syndicate, essentially. So you're hired to steal, to hurt people, to bribe, to all sorts of horrible things. And the running joke of the game is that I never overtly say whether or not you are actually birds.
Yeah.
It's never clear in the rule book if you're actually birds or if you're just people who are like really into birds and you get feathers like woven into your coat or something. Totally unclear. Who knows?
I love that. I love that vagueness. But yeah, so you're kind of touching on for this first kind of part of it, when does a rewrite of anything, warrant talking about essentially a new game, right? Kind of not just expanding upon maybe like a single rule, but really just like, okay, do I now make, like, when you talk about Corvid Court and how it's resistance light, do I now look at a second edition and make my own version of resistance, right? Or something like that. Like that's what I feel the sort of scope we're talking about here in terms of what constitutes a second edition or a redo. I think it's something at the base design level that says this is different. Right.
Yeah. It can't just be, here's some more skills. Here's like a couple of more classes, second edition, right? Like that doesn't feel like a second edition. So exactly like you're saying, the thing that I've been grappling with making a second edition with Corvid Court, or what would ultimately be like a fuller version, because right now I think it's a 24-page zine, if I remember correctly. So, the standard zine size for RPGs. But if I wanted to make it into a book or a bigger zine or something like that, I would need to justify that by having more there. And exactly like you're saying, thinking about this idea of resistance light, which I like, and how can I add on to that while staying true to the idea of resistance light? Like I could just make Corvid Court with the actual resistance system. I could revert back to D10s. I could revert back to how Fallout is triggered. I could revert back to all of that stuff. And obviously I would have a full book because we know that makes full books.
Yeah.
But that's not what Corvid Court is in my head. And so what does the second edition look like is still one of those things that I'm grappling with, because I know I want to do more. I know I basically need to find ways to kind of codify a lot of the ideas that are in my head about what resistance light means and actually put them on the page. Because and it's something that I write in a lot of my books is, hey, you might notice, reader, that there's a lot of things missing here or a lot of like gaps. That's because I want you to fill them. And I think maybe a second edition has me doing a little bit of that lifting rather than the reader, and me putting more substance of what the rules are supposed to be doing for the reader. I think that's a start of what a second edition is for Corvid Court, for example, but I still don't think that's enough. And part of it is also what we were talking about earlier with how things are being produced right now, how they're being published. It's digital, right? People are putting things out digitally. I'm just a sucker for print just because I like to hold things.
Absolutely.
But by no means are people obligated to print the RPGs that they make. And so for me, I think I don't want to call anything a second edition or work on it as a second edition until I plan on printing it again. Because in my mind, I can keep updating a PDF on itch and keep just giving you more and more and more, fixing something. Kind of like how people who put up beta files, beta tests, play tests of their games. I kind of see myself doing that with games until eventually I go, now I've added enough that I can justify printing it again. And now we're starting to enter second edition territory. Like with Slayers, it's hard to think about a second edition, or it's not hard. It's interesting because there are actually, that one I can actually think of things that I want to add, things that I think would actually change the way that the game would play while still staying true to the core design. I don't think I want to abandon the rule of 4 and the asymmetry. Those things are still kind of fundamental to Slayers, but there are things that I think could be changed or added that would make the game actually look like a game that I would more traditionally play. Because right now Slayers isn't a game that I would traditionally play. And I think that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, lightning round sort of question here. What would be, if you've had a thought, one of those changes that you might make that might kind of bolster game, like name what that mechanic is and then what you would switch it to?
So one thing that I noticed when I was looking at all the classes that I made, and then I looked at the classes that people made in the Slayers Jam, there were some really creative folks who made advances for the classes that were not combat oriented. And I realized, wait a minute, all of my character progression is purely based off of getting better at killing monsters, which makes sense. It's a monster hunting game, but like, one would have to assume that there must be interesting things that happens to the tactician as they become a better tactician that isn't solely I'm better at killing monsters, but they must have like an actual narrative impact. And so finding a way for character progression to more substantially affect the non-monster hunting component of the game, I think is important. And that's inherently linked then to the other big thing that I want to change, which is the cycle of play of Slayers. Which right now, the way that I just happened to write it when I was first putting together an adventure was as a 3-act structure. Act 1, here's the monster you all are hunting. Introduce the monster, introduce the threat. Do some investigation. Act 2, do some investigation, maybe have a fight just to test you out. And then Act 3, do the big fight. And that made sense to me as I was writing an adventure because I never had written adventures, like actual structured adventures before. And so that structure has just unfortunately stuck as like the default mode of playing Slayers, when I don't think if I were to GM it today, I would structure it in a 3-act way at all. I would leave it much more open, much more, I don't want to say sandboxy, but I wouldn't put it on those rails to the same degree. And so if you've got character advances or character skills or things like that are much more interesting and interact with the non-monster fighting stuff, then you are supporting that change of the cycle of play. If I want the cycle of play to be less about just murdering monsters, I also need to give the player something that lets them interact with that in an interesting way.
When I first started touching on what you're just sort of speaking to about the feel of the game and that act structure towards adventures and changing that. When I first picked up Slayer, before I opened the cover of the PDF, because I do not have a physical print, unfortunately. Yeah.
We can fix that.
Please don't make me cry. But I envisioned the game out of the gate, like from the description of it, as like Monster Hunter World. Like that was the first thing my mind immediately connected it to. I know that some of the cover art is a little bit more, at least to me, it feels a little bit more like city. What do I want to say? It feels a little bit more D&D when I think about the cover in of itself. Like you are an adventurer and these are the monsters you go hunt. But my first inclination was like, man, I am excited to like just go out in the wild, gather some resources, classes, make some stuff, and hunt down some really cool, like, because I've always tried, at least when I first started playing D&D back in the day, I always try to shoehorn like a monster hunter monster in there, like one of the big bads, like the Lagaia Cruise, or the flagship or Thalos, right? And it never felt quite as satisfying because it was tactical based, and I think to make that effective, like all the dodge rolling and all the pressure, I think that's to be very theater of the mind or cinematic based mechanics. But anyways, the point being is that I agree in the sense that, like, I think that having advances that talk about, because it's a role-playing game, and at what point do you say what is and is not a role-playing game, right? And is something so combat-focused that it's not role-playing? Because D&D is very much heavily combat-focused, but we have seen with many actual plays out there that role-playing does occur, and that's usually at the lifting power of the players at the table, right? It's not at the lifting power of the game in of itself. Doesn't give you many options to role-play in terms of that. But I definitely think that for me, my personal opinion, I think Slayers would be amazing as that sort of semi-sandboxy, explore the environment, learn about the world, sort of like almost a Dark Souls lore structure, right? Like you find out lore through items or bone or whatever have you, loose NPCs.
Yeah, like that's that. And the thing is, as you're saying all this stuff, that's the game that's always been in my head. But when I wrote Slayers, I'll admit I wrote it about 2 years ago, or that's when it started kind of really hitting the page, and it came from me being at the height of doing board game design, which was this very structured thing. And so for me, I was thinking, I was playing asymmetrical board games, and I was thinking of structured sort of play, and so that's why the adventure has this structured 3-structure act, and why the game does one thing really well, which is fighting monsters, but then ultimately is not supporting the players in doing the thing that I actually want to support, which is all the other stuff. And so I think a second edition isn't going to be one that changes fundamentally or adds much to the combat side, because I think I'm pretty happy with that. What it ultimately is giving players the support so that they're not doing the lifting, like you were saying, that I'm not putting the onus on the players to be the ones to figure out how to make role-playing interesting in Slayers, but instead the game has something in there that is going to help you and make you want to explore, to make you want to go talk to that NPC, or make you want to go explore that ruin. Besides, it's your job, go do it.
Yeah, exactly. This is what the game
right
is
now.
about. Go.
Right.
Yeah, as I kind of, for anyone who doesn't know, or who, maybe someone listens to this a year down the line, I've released a game of similar make, but as I'm fucking around with this, and cursing is fine if you feel like.
Good. Thank God.
Yeah. No, we're cool. Children beware. There is cursing, but I have the mouth of a sailor, so I'll figure that one out. But as I'm fucking around with this, I'm trying to make Devil May Cry into a game, right? And it's very like action move. It's all about the buttons you press, and there's a story behind it, but that's structured for Devil May Cry. So my big hurdle right now is like, how do I make Devil May Cry the game have role play in it? How do I inject some of that role play goodness? And I think I'm coming to some of the same like hurdles that you yourself came with Slayers. Is that I made a great system. I have a great like combo chain system I'm liking, but now I'm like, okay, but why? Where is the why here?
Right. I've been seeing the stuff that you've been putting in the brain trust. And yeah, absolutely. It's such a cool combat system. And then you're gonna have absolutely the same experience as me, where you're gonna release this thing, and you're gonna be like, wow, this combat system rocks. Good luck with the rest of it. Because that's kind of what my book says. That's what my GM section is mostly like. Balance doesn't matter. Go figure it out. Have fun.
Yeah.
Fight some monsters. And at the time I was happy with that. I think after a few months out, I know that I can do more with that side of things. And I haven't been brewing on it. And it's a part of it is going back to that idea of updating versus second edition. Like, I learned through the Slayers Jam that people can put together content for Slayers very quickly and very easily. And that as a result, the game can change very quickly based off of whatever like jam stuff you want to throw into your game. People were making things that fundamentally changed the setting. People were releasing things that had advances that affected things that weren't combat. And I'm watching all of these things and I'm going, okay, so at what point do we just sort of allow that stuff to be the dictator of what the future of Slayers is third-party content ultimately shifts what Slayers is about, or is it my responsibility to eventually be like, I see what you all want, I will try my best to replicate that in a second edition, like that's what D&D is dealing with right now. They've got all that nonsense with races, right? And like the species, and they're like, well, just homebrew it. And like people have been fixing D&D for years now. And when is D&D going to be, when are they eventually going to actually fix their problem? And I think many of us expect them to fix the problem. I'm not saying my thing is the same scale, but I'm just wondering, like, at what point is the expectation for me to release Slayers second edition that supports these things if I'm seeing people wanting them? Or is it one thing where I encourage then those third-party people to be like, the city is yours to make of it what you will. And I don't, it's a weird line. It's a weird line to think about which, to walk on.
Yeah, it's always trying to, this is with everything, not just game design, everyone listening, but you have to decide first what your personal taste is in your game, and no one's taste is going to be the same as the next person sitting next to you. Taste is formed from the decisions of the things we love and the things we hate and how we voice those opinions. In the D&D example, this is my crazy tinfoil hat moment here, but this is part of the reason that I hate the DM's Guild, because Wizards of the Coast is taking 30% or whatever from you for all of your creativity to create races that are not bound by old lore, to create classes that people have been asking for years, to create setting information, and they just get to you're like semi-contracted designers with none of the intellectual property to yourself, right? And for me, that stuff is hyper dirty. I do not like that. And they certainly have the means to change all, like you were talking about the race stuff. They have all the means right now. They could literally reprint a 5.5 player's handbook. I have no doubt in my mind that just erases all of that. But they have to keep the last 40 years worth of customer base somewhat happy. Why? I don't know, because Hasbro rules them. I don't know about that either. But that all trickles down to when we make changes as designers, we have to think about the weight of what we are expecting from our game and then what our fans are expecting from our game. Because to some effect, we are not creating for ourselves. We are not going to purchase our own game and then thus fuel our electric bills and food, right? At some point, we have to decide, this is the art I want to make, and this is the input I'm willing to take from my patrons. And, for your first few games, people listening out there, please don't bend to the will of the populace. Figure out what you like first. Your taste has to come before theirs, no doubt. Make the game you want to make, and then figure it out from there. That's what second editions are for.
Exactly.
But after that, you have to start thinking about who are you appealing to. Not everyone's going to like your game. You can't catch all. You can't create the biggest net in the world and get every single dollar. So get 100 people who are willing to pay $50 for your game, or 150 in D&D's case, or more. So
I remember when I released Corvid Court, I was so excited, and people were digging it. And I eventually got my first 4-star rating on itch, which anybody who's familiar with itch knows that's a bullet to the head of that game. That fucks you on analytics so badly. And it really is, you either get a 5-star or you're doomed. And I remember looking at the review, because they actually wrote something which was helpful, rather than just 4 stars and then they just peace out. And they basically said, this is a cool rules light thing. It's too rules light for me. And I remember looking at that and going, oh shit, do I need to add a bunch of stuff? Like I started panic designing, and I didn't ultimately change anything, but I did start panicking right away and thinking like, if this person thinks it's too rules light, then there must be other people who think that, and I need to fix this immediately, which was ignoring what I wanted Corvid Court to be, which was this really fast, light thing. So I totally get where you're coming from, this idea of like, you need to know what your scope is and what you want out of the game, and to not, especially in your early designs, because Corvid Court was I think it was my second thing that I put out, to not immediately change everything when you get one person saying, hey, I don't like this part of your game.
Yeah.
Don't panic design.
I think comments like that always trigger that sort of imposter syndrome from people. Like, you think you put out such a beautiful product or wonderful product, or you feel very proud of what you did, and then it just takes one person to be like, "Man, it's all right," and you're like, "Well, fuck me, I'm not God anymore."
Why am I even bothering doing this?
Yeah, that can be really tough, especially when you're starting out. I certainly know I like criticism. I feel like I can deal with criticism, but when it comes from like an anonymous body, for some reason that just holds so much more weight, because they don't know who I am, they don't know what I like, and thus they're taking whatever this product is at its absolute face value. That's why those things, at least for me, feel so much more heavy. And this is speaking about like food I've made in the past, like when customers would send it back and I'm like, I thought the sauce is really good. But, that's also taste. So before we get into light, the next thing I always sort of like touch on is future thoughts. And this is mainly to noticing any trends that you feel like are happening in the industry at the recording of this. So in your sphere, or in your own personal thoughts, what are some trends that you may be seeing like on Twitter, in Discords, on like your itch comments that people are like asking for? Something that always keeps blipping your radar, like, accessibility, diversity, or, even like mechanical stuff. Like, I'm tired of seeing the D20 and things, or even your own personal sort of wants for industry change. Again, like accessibility, diversity, or even like, let's let the D20 die. Right.
Right. Definitely, we're consistently seeing things about accessibility. There was a really good conversation. Time doesn't mean anything anymore. I want to say it was a few days ago, but it could have been like months ago at this point. In the Brain Trust, about making products that were accessible in terms of like screen readers and things like that. And not participating, but just reading the conversation and just absorbing all this stuff. And like what I'm learning, which I think is something that I'm just perpetually learning in my life, is that I have lived in such a bubble, Jeremy. And
I feel you. I super feel you.
And so for me, I'm probably seeing things and thinking, this is an interesting trend, when it's probably something that's been going on forever, and I just never had to think about it or see it. So like the accessibility thing, for example, I've never had to personally myself have to deal with screen readers. I do have to do stuff like with my slides and stuff like that with my students. I have to put together things that allow my students to get the material from me in an accessible way. But I never even would have like made that translation to design, like for my games. And so that conversation in the Brain Trust was really, really interesting. It's going on right now. There's an Asian cyberpunk jam going on itch, which is like a fantastic counterpoint to, CD Projekt Red's cyberpunk game that just came out that is highly problematic. And it's problematic for a number of things, but one of the big problematic things about cyberpunk is it kind of stands on like the pillar of Asianism, essentially. And so seeing cool jams like that, I think, is a really great trend. But again, maybe it's not a trend, maybe it's been going on forever and I'm only just seeing it. But I think that sort of stuff, in terms of like not writing for somebody else, or like to try and represent somebody else. And this is something we see in board games all the time. The white guy that makes the Japanese board game about samurai and shit like that, right?
Legend of the Five Rings people.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like the Asians Represent podcast is fantastic because they go into all of that stuff and like their
Chef's
read
kiss.
throughs.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. And like my skin recoils as they read some of like the older stuff, but even like the newer stuff, you see it. And like I saw on Twitter just yesterday making the rounds, another board game that hit Kickstarter that is white guys making a katana game, you know, and I think it's called Katana, and it's got a very Asian font, and so it's cool seeing like the Asians Represent podcast win the Emmy for best podcast, for example. Like there's clearly something happening where people are like, this is ridiculous. This is honestly ridiculous that we're seeing this. And so I'm glad. It sucks that despite all of that, Wizards of the Coast is still doing like is not budging on any of that stuff. So like the trends exist at the indie level, right? They exist at this smaller level, but I don't see grand sweeping trends at a higher level in any way. And you know, I don't know if we should ever even expect that at this point out of Wizards.
No, not at all. I mean, they're going to keep doing the model that they want to do that makes them whatever amount of money they like to make. I don't know what that number looks like, but
the biggest number you can imagine.
Yeah. Quinn
Gillian. Add another 0. As a result, we're getting cool game jams. I think that's one thing that I'm seeing a lot is game jams that are getting more and more like specialized, because they used to, you know, Itch hosts game jams because Itch was not made for us. It was not made for the tabletop role-playing community, but we have sort of like glommed onto it.
Yeah.
Like, please,
this is ours now. Yeah.
But, you know, the concept of game jams has been going on for such a long time, and they were usually like broader concept, like make an action game, you know, make a game about space. And you're like, okay, that's cool, but like it's a huge thing. And now we're getting these really hyper-specific jams, which I think is, rather than like excluding people where they're like, oh, that's too specific for me, I think it's bringing out people to the space, because they're going, wait, I can make a game about that? Because that's something that I really like or I have a thought about, and I didn't know that I could make a game about that. And so I think these like hyper-specific game jams are really cool in terms of encouraging either new designers or designers to just think about things in a way that they never thought about before.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking to the points of like not, when we talk about accessibility in lots of different areas, you know, initially this opened with e-readers, but also transitioned into racism, transitioned into diversity, transitioned into approachability by different venues and perspectives. And I agree with you. I love all these niche jams that are coming out. That what I think for me is that I think people of minority-based demographics are hesitant to join because they don't know what circles are going to truly accept them. At least, you know, when I think about, for a long time, when the Black Lives Matter movement kind of came into a head, for me, I am half black. I like to call myself black because that is the culture I recognize as myself as an American. But ultimately, I'm an American. Black American. And for a long time, I'm very light skinned. If anyone sees a profile picture of me somewhere, I'm sure you'll not assume I am a black person by first glance, but I would use that to my advantage, because my thought is that my likes and my perspectives and my experiences are going to be tinted by someone's perception of what a black person is the second they learn that that's the thing. And for game design and for people getting into game design, I guess what I'm trying to say here is there are circles and there are communities of really amazing people, really kind people, and really helpful people that will look beyond the color of your skin and embolden you to make content about anything. And what I really realize, at least for American culture speaking specifically, is that we've been sort of whitewashed for a really long time. And you know the phrase, there's no such thing as an original idea. I don't think that's true in America, because we have no original ideas from the lenses we've been using for forever, right? But then we get movies like Get Out. We get stuff like The Handmaid's Tale, perspectives from people that have not been the industry norm that are really eye-opening and are really beautiful, both artistically, but also socially and community-based as well. So yeah, I think noticing that sort of trend and that want for diversity and accessibility is really important. And what I hope with this design trend segment is that any game designer listening, or any wannabe game designer listening, or any veteran who feels like they've sort of plateaued and don't know why their games aren't selling anymore, one of these trends might be you're in or the reason. So consider that. This is where the more rainbow.
You're right. The star goes by.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so true. Like what you're saying, like this call for people to understand that this space is for them as well. Mm-hmm. It sucks because I have never had anybody tell me that, right? Nobody has ever had to tell me, Spencer, you are allowed to design games. The assumption was, I can design games, right? And for the listeners, if you haven't seen me in real life, I'm a white-ass guy. I'm a super white-ass guy. And so, exactly like you're saying, the going into a space that is predominantly made up of people that look like me, and then wanting to bring in a perspective that is not my perspective, of course that would just suck, right? Why would you ever want to get into that? This is something to speak to a totally different field in academia. So I'm a professor. My partner teaches at high school, both at the high school level and in higher ed. There is an ongoing discussion about policy on how to bring in more diverse faculty. Because, the assumption is always, let's find diverse students, but diverse faculty. Why do all the faculty look like me? And that's an ongoing conversation about, well, why would somebody who doesn't look like you, Spencer, not want to be in academia right now? And it's bringing out really important conversations in that space. And I think we're having some of those conversations in the design space as well. And I think that's super cool.
Yeah, me too, for sure. So, Spencer, I know that we're getting into the game you're sort of really heart-throbbing over right now. And, I think we'll touch on both, creating this game. And I know you've done a design commentary on that currently. So, again, check out Spencer's YouTube. Has a great, 50-minute deep dive into all the modules he's made for this so far. But you have been crafting this, as you call it, love letter to the Destiny series, sort of both mechanically and in the lore and the setting that's involved there. But I also, you've been having a really big conversation about kind of changing the scope of what it means to sell a game with this season's pass idea. So first, why don't we touch on, why Light, and what do you see for the future of Light? How big, what's the scope of that project? Because again, there is a deep dive on YouTube that you can look at that I don't want to rehash in here. But yeah, what's sort of your intended scope over the course of the year with that and the season's pass?
So that's a really good question, because the scope of the game has changed. I think it changes every day or every other day as I'm thinking about it. Because when I've been talking about wanting to make a Destiny Heartbreaker for a long time. And I honestly had been working for a long time making it as a Resistance game, because that's just what I do. I think I make Resistance games because I like them. That's what Corvid Court and Seasons were. And I was like, what if I did Destiny but with Resistance? And I was working on that for a while, and then Light came, like a fever dream. The Rules Light version hit the page. The modular idea hit the page, and I was like, I like this way better. Let's do this one instead. And so for me, looking at games like 2400, which is obviously I borrow heavily in terms of the format that Light is put together, using Beeple's art, which I think is, I wonder if Beeple is aware at this point about how how many RPG designers are using that art, because the 24XX jam that took place, like everybody's using that art and I'm using it now, and I know other people have been using it for things that aren't those two games, so that's just a random tangent. But when I first put it out, I wanted to just sit on it for a while, because I honestly just wanted to sit on designing for the rest of the year. Having just put the Dust Kickstarter out and wrapped that up in terms of running the campaign, I was like, all right, I've done enough. And then again, that fever dream. And so I put out all those modules, and now I'm finally putting the game to bed. But I have this season pass idea, which I'm like super excited and terrified of. As far as I know, I'm not aware of anybody that has done something exactly like what I have in mind. Should I explain? I don't think I explained it in the video, my deep dive. Do I?
No, I don't think you touched base on the seasons past. Yeah, absolutely. Talk about what that idea is and how you think it's going to sort of shake things up.
So, borrowing from Destiny's own model and the model of other video games, the season pass is something that I have in mind, where over the course of time, some X amount of time, which I'm going to just say is 4 months, you will get 4 new modules or releases for Light, things to expand on or change the rules of the game. So, approximately 1 a month, but I'm taking Adam Vass's advice and saying, don't say 1 a month, just in case you don't stay exactly true to that. So you're going to get 4 things, and it's sort of that drip feed, right? You get content drip fed to you, rather than as like, here's a new book, or here's a whole new full expansion. Mm-hmm. And my idea is that you would pay for it like you would pay for a season pass, meaning you pay for it all at once, and you just know that over the course of that 4 months, you're going to get content, rather than like buying it a la carte in like individual pieces, which I think I'm ultimately going to make available in case you don't want to do this whole season pass thing. Like, I don't want to content block people and say like, you buy the pass or you get nothing. That doesn't sound cool.
Not fun at all. And not fun for your wallet either. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right. I'm not going to turn those people away.
Yeah.
So, my intent is that if it's 4 months, what I can do is I can do 3 of those in a year, and I'm going to do the trial run. I'm going to start in January, and it's going to be the first season, and I've got it kind of lined up in terms of some of the modules that I want to do, and I want to see how it works. I want to see if people understand it, if people buy into it, if they like it, because it's not a season pass isn't a groundbreaking idea. These people have likely played Destiny. That's why they like Light.
Super Smash, yeah, absolutely.
Right. But translating that to a TTRPG subscription, essentially, I think is different. And my big thing that I've been grappling with is this versus Patreon. Because Patreon's the known thing. People get that. They know it's a monthly thing, or every creation thing. It's got the communication tools. It's got polls. It's got all that stuff. Itch doesn't have that stuff.
Right.
But I think the season pass is a really cool idea.
I think so too. I think so as well.
So because I have the luxury of experimenting with my stuff this isn't my day job, right? So I can play around with ideas. I want to try this season pass thing and see how it works. Now my grand scheme, Jeremy, my grand scheme.
Throw it at me. Show me the whiteboard, dude.
Is at the end of every season, I put together a print of the stuff, of the modules that came out that season. And maybe there's a way that I can figure out how to sell the season pass. Like, how you can do like physical rewards or different rewards on itch to if you're a season pass holder and you throw $5, you're going to get the print at the end of the season too. And then ultimately combine it all into Light year 1, like the actual book at the end of the year that's got all 3 seasons. It's got the core rules and the core modules as like a thing that's like, here's 1 year of Light. And the whole point is to reward the season pass holders to find ways like to not be like, you paid me once, now pay me again and pay me again.
Yeah.
Like, to find, and again, I think that's so much easier done with Patreon than it is with itch, but I want to see if I can figure this out. Because if I can, that's going to allow other people to play around with this idea, and so that they don't have to go start their own Patreon. Like, because that might seem intimidating, or that might seem like a lot of work if you want to do like this small, like iterative process. Like, do you really need to make a Patreon to do that, or can we keep it all on itch as a platform and we just need to like iron out the details?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I fucking love that idea. I will talk like consumer structures all day with a person. I swear to God. But what I really, I think what as you said, it's not a terribly groundbreaking idea, right? Because the some capacity stuff like Kickstarter is like this a little bit, right? Like you're paying early access for stuff. It's just with Kickstarter, it's like, you don't know if you're going to get it this year or 2 years from this, right? This is a little bit more of like, I promise you will see this ish in 4 months, and that's why it's priced like this, right? And I think that creating some sort of like longevity product for subscription holders is amazing, because what is the ultimate goal of any person that makes a business, right? You want to find your 100, 1,000 true fans, whatever that term is, or quote, or whatever it is, who are going to come back to you year after year and are willing to spend like $100 a month or something like that on your content. I mean, that's the dream. And I think stuff like that creates like a little drip feed from one person to the other, that's also manageable for people who maybe see games as a pretty frivolous thing and don't want to spend that much money on it, right? So having some sort of early access pricing that allows them to be like, yeah, I can spend $10 here on January to get like a bunch of stuff by April, right? No, I think it's amazing. And also having options for people who are like, yeah, I didn't get on the season pass, but I can definitely splurge in April on like something that's $2 or $3 more, whatever your price structure looks like. These are just random numbers. I really love the idea of that end of the year book. I think that's really cool. And it also, I mean, this depends on the person designing, but it also keeps you in deadline mode pretty much the whole year, right? You're like, okay, I'm gonna have to put out 12 pieces of content that is in some structured doable for me, and at the end of the year everyone gets this cool $15 book that other people can pick up for a little bit more or whatever, and other people just get it in the mail as like a surprise, which is also always nice, having something that you subscribe to that like, here's your little present for being really cool and really supporting this idea. I think the season pass is chef's kiss, no doubt.
I'm glad that you think that. I think it's going to be cool, and I that you vocalizing it, that idea of that like kind of constant deadline is. I think that's why I'm into this idea. I think it's also why I'm interested in the concept of a Patreon, because like Adam Vass and Chris Bizet, they can put out things like every month or every other month because they are machines like that. Right? They're very good at that sort of thing, which is maybe. I actually had a long conversation with my partner about this the other day, where she was like, is that what you want? Is that what you want to be? Do you want to be a machine like that who puts it out? And I'm not trying to disparage that sort of rate.
They're not unfeeling monsters who create
exactly.
games. Yeah. If you're listening, we don't think that of you.
But she pushed on me and was like, is that what you want to do with this? Because you are having fun with this right now. Will that diminish your fun? And I think by making it like a Patreon, and as like it's this big, I think a Patreon is just a much bigger to do than this season pass on itch, as this sort of like, it's just light, it's just a season pass. I think that is it's more on the scale of what works for me personally and kind of what I want to get out of the experience. So, but it's still exactly like you said, gives me that deadline, which. As we said, I think all the way at the beginning of this, I'm all about having that little bit of structure in my life.
I need it.
It helps me so much.
Yeah, I'm currently with this podcast struggling with like, do I start a Patreon? What is like my sort of crowdfunding method for sure? And there's, I've looked at stuff like Ko-fi and Gumroad. Oh, Gumroad might be something interesting to touch base with. I think it's like a product sales or commission sales sort of thing. You can like upload products, but that's not what this podcast is about. Well, technically it sort of is, but yeah, I think Patreon is a huge project for sure. And it, in some form, it is not the best communications tool from what I'm understanding from different people's opinions on like YouTube or whatever. It doesn't have like a good archival system, so people can't really pull up like older posts or old products or whatever without you like fandangling a database thing that they have a link to. So it has a lot of work in outside of itself. I think figuring out how to do it in itch is cool because obviously Patreon's not changing unless it's for itself. Like it's going to change what it needs to change. But for itch, especially over the course of its existence, I think it's changed a lot based on what the demographic attached to it is. Like before it was very video game focused, right? Or even board game focused to some extent. And then role-playing games are really starting to like tack onto there. Maybe doing the season pass thing alters how transactional or payment structures work in it. Like maybe someone takes notice and it's like, okay, we want to be able to facilitate this because it also means more money for us in the end, right? So
right. Can itch find a way to set up a recurring sort of thing?
Exactly.
Like every 4 months you come to this user and say, hey, it's the next payment for this person, which just happens to be the next season for Light, but like it's, setting up a recurring thing like that would help. And there's, there are tools in play with itch, and I've been talking with people like Adam Vass about how to make this work, because if I was to release all of these modules as individual products, then obviously my main screen is just going to be filled up with all these little Light things, and I don't want to do that. And so like using the collections, for example, as a way of saying like, here's Light Season 1, here's Light Season 2, and so there are ways of playing around with it that the sort of what I've devoted this month to is I've got like a bunch of draft projects on itch right now that nobody else can see, that I'm just like tinkering with and seeing like, all right, how does this look? I've had, I did a first write-up of season 1 and I showed it to Adam and he was like, it's good, but it sounds like you're talking to designers. And
Sure.
I think that's very much the way that I tend to talk, and which makes sense because largely the people I talk to on Twitter and things like this are also designers. But I need to be able to sell it to people who aren't designers. I need to be able to sell it to people who are just super into Destiny and want to play a Destiny RPG. And so I'm learning a lot by talking to people who are much more experienced and better at this sort of like promoting your stuff, and then like learning how to present it in a way that is going to be appealing. And that's the thing that I'm grappling with right now with itch, is like, how do I make something like a season pass visible and clear, like right away? This is a pre-order for something you're getting over 4 months. That's the grapple right now.
I mean, what do you think this podcast is about?
Yeah, exactly.
Learning from others, right? This is definitely the business of game design, right? So, for those listening at home, it's important to think about like, yeah, game design is at some extent an art and also a form of entertainment. But if you want to make this a thing that you do, there's branding, marketing, transactional processes that you're gonna have to figure out. So, I think in Adam Bell's video, one of his tips that we talked about were community-based, and how you don't have to put yourself in the pool with everyone else, but put your legs in the water and listen to what people are saying, and maybe reach out to some people that you think share similar ideas with yourself, and get an idea for, is this a good idea? Do you think, I want some opinions of people who are a little bit more well-versed than I am. Don't be afraid to ask people, because people can surprise you. They can be giving, for sure. And like you're saying, a lot of people in the Brain Trust, shout out to the Brain Trust folk, get your big brain on. They've been instrumental in a rapid evolution of my personal game design ability, and also looking into the perspective and scope of people who have done a lot more for a far longer time than myself, or to anyone that I may have found on Twitter by accident. So
oh yeah, a huge shout out to the Brain Trust. Like I literally don't think Slayers would have been successful, or as successful as it was, if it wasn't for Adam reaching out to me and saying, hey, this Slayers thing that you're talking about seems interesting. Do you want to join this Discord? And like that fundamentally changed my life as a designer. So yeah. Huge shout outs.
Huge. Great. This is the last transitionary piece of
exciting.
So this last one is sort of like a lightning round, like the trends thing. This is a tip that you yourself think would be beneficial to game designers out there. And I have a little table that I'm going to roll on here.
Oh, okay.
It's always random. I don't pre-plan it. So your prompt is publishing. What is a tip that you would have for a new game designer, or even maybe someone who's like got a game out in PDF but doesn't quite know how to get it to like book or market it? What would be like a publishing tip in your experience that you could provide to someone?
What I learned with the first wave of success with Corvid Court is that your book doesn't have to be pretty to get people's eyes on it. Corvid Court had a somewhat attractive cover, which I think was the thing that got people to actually click on it. But the rest of the book itself was not exciting to look at. It wasn't pretty, but it genuinely had like a lot of people like it has easily the most number of downloads of any of my games on itch, like it is, and a large number of those downloads came from the period of time when it did not have Maria's very good layout, but when it had my very bad layout. And so I think many people work under the assumption that to publish something, it needs to have like great graphic design, and like that, like the pages of the book need to have some sort of background, or you need to have some sort of page elements. And obviously you want to, like, that's a cool thing to get to, but that shouldn't be the thing that's stopping you from putting that that PDF up on itch right now. Because at the very least, what you can do with itch is you can put things up as in development. Right? It doesn't have to be listed as like the done thing. So go ahead and put it up there and just say, yeah, here's this thing. The words are cool. Ignore the fact that it's black text on white background.
That's a Google Doc, yeah.
Right. Just read the words. And then, you know, if the words seem cool and enough people are talking about it, then you can worry about the rest of that stuff. But I think that's the thing that stopped me from getting into design for so long, was that I worked under the assumption that it had to be perfect. And that came from my board game design background, where I was like, it has to be perfect. It has to be balanced. We have to have the art done. We have to have everything ready before we can even like play test it. Which was like play testing was so slow as a result, because we were like making full prototypes rather than just writing things down on paper. Like writing down things on paper and playing that is just as fun. So I learned the valuable lesson of just start putting it out there. It doesn't have to be pretty to make it worth people's time. I think that's a really important thing for a new designer. Yeah,
I am definitely in that row of design. It's like, I don't have the graphic design chops, so I really don't want to put it out there. But it's true. It's like people can get really attracted to the idea of something for sure, and maybe you're the person that innovates on the resistance system, or maybe you're the person that innovates on the Forge in the Dark system, and you just, I mean, all Forge in the Dark is D6, Bulls of D6. Shadowrun did it before them, and someone did it before Shadowrun. So, you know, don't let your ideas speak for themselves. They don't need the pretty gussied up stuff of amazing artist commissions, which, let's not be wrong though for a second. We buy print books to make a statement in our homes sometimes. We get special edition covers. Yeah, art sells.
100%.
There's no doubt about that. But especially starting out, just do it. Just get an idea out there. Let people play the game, because that also gives you avenues for play testing, for people's input and criticisms, and gives you an ability to learn faster. The faster you fail, the faster you learn, right? So if you're worried about success, you never put anything out there, you're never learning. You're never applying it to the real world, and thus you have no idea what sort of product you have in your hands until you put it out there. So I think that's a really great tip, Spencer, for sure.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, everyone, we've come to the end of our talk here today. Yeah, I know. Where am I at? An hour or so of conversation. That's great. I love that. That's a lot to work with. Spencer, where, you know, it'll be in the show notes, but where can people find you? Give me your shameless plugs. Hit the people with it. You got to get people to know who you are.
Yeah. So it's going to be GilaRPGs everywhere. So that's GILA RPGs. That's me on Twitter. That's GilaRPGs on itch. and it's GilaRPGs.com for my own website, which is where I sell my physical stuff. So like you can get all my digital stuff off of itch, but if you want the books and the zines, because like I said earlier, I'm a sucker for being able to hold my things in my hand, like the actual game in my hand. All that stuff lives on my website.
Great. And then go ahead.
That's everywhere. I'm just trying to. Oh yeah, and I have a YouTube.
Yes,
YouTube. I forgot.
That's what I was gonna say.
Which is not GilaRPG, which is my old handle from when I first made a screen name as a little boy. I'm the Gila Boy. The Gila Boy. I've literally had that handle since AOL first came to my home when we had 5 or 56K internet. Like, that's been my handle for everything. So that's why I'm GilaRPGs, is because I was the Gila Boy.
Yes, that's awesome. I love that so much. There's so much play in that. The child always lives within you, people. Sometimes it's just sleeping.
Oh yeah. I'm the whole, just a real quick thing. The only reason I have that name is because my dad encouraged me to come up with a unique name. Because, young Spencer was like, I want to be Spider-Man. And, you type in Spider-Man, it's like, Spider-Man's taken. So you could be Spider-Man 16352. And you're like, well, that's not a good name. My dad was like, think of something that nobody else is going to have. And we had recently learned about Gila monsters in school. So I was like, that's a cool, animal. What if I was the Gila boy instead? And that's where it came from. So my dad, thank God, encouraged me to come up with a unique name. So I'm not Spider-Man 15623. I'm the Gila boy.
The image of little baby Spencer discovering Gila monsters and making that his superhero name is amazing.
That's me. That's my origin story.
All right. Well, Spencer, I thank you so much for being here today. Everyone at home, I hope you learned something today. And we will see you next time here on Draw Your Dice. Say bye to the people, Spencer.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. This was a blast.
It was a pleasure. All right, that's a wrap. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and hang out with Spencer and I. We really appreciate it. You can find links and resources down below in the show notes, such as getting in touch with Spencer or other episodes with similar topics. If you want to be a part of the conversation, please come and join the community Discord server. Also, make sure to subscribe to the Draw Your Dice Patreon, where you can get access to early releases of episodes from as soon as we interview. Thanks again for stopping by, and as always, I will catch you next time.